Hello, friends. We are back to Between Two Sermons. Rob Catalani.
And John Amayo.
Yeah. And we're in different chairs today because John gave the sermon. Hopefully you have enjoyed it and are doing something with your small group. And let me say a few things as we set this up. This is the last message, not in the book of Acts. That is to say, it's not the last chapter. But in our series, we've had 3 series. And this last one has been really called A New Mission, really looking at how does the Church of Jesus, first in the first century, but we're asking ourselves this question: how do we bring the gospel into our world today, and how did they do it? In the last many weeks, John, you mentioned this when you opened, that this was Paul in Europe, and Paul and his gang. It's now been, a couple chapters, but perhaps, a couple years, where beginning ultimately, I suppose, in when they finally reach Philippi in Acts chapter 16, happens a little before that, but they're really fully in the first on-purpose mission trip journey, planning a church in Philippi. Then they go to Thessalonica, Berea. We talked about Athens last week. We're in full steam ahead Europe, I guess to say, and very much a place that was the wild, wild west, or the new frontier for the gospel. And then here, where we land this series, we're now in the 3rd missionary journey. Those of us who are familiar with that terminology, it's the last one recorded, that is the last journey of the Apostle Paul relative to church planting. And he's in the city of Ephesus, which you didn't spend tons of time, which one could, because there's a couple chapters on it. It gets a book of the Bible, just like the Philippian church did. But say a few words about how you entered into this passage and where you want to go with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating passage. And as we just enter into even the Ephesus as a place, it's just so interesting. Paul goes Athens, Corinth. We didn't even touch on Corinth.
That's right.
Where he spends a lot of time. And then he goes to Ephesus, which is, for his mind, where he intended to go from the very beginning.
Right. That's so interesting that you brought that up.
The Spirit prevented him from going to Ephesus in the beginning, but now he says, okay, now you can go to Ephesus. Yeah. And we see why a little bit in the passage.
That's right.
He's already at work now in Ephesus in ways that he wasn't before.
Yeah.
So,
which is interesting. I went to say that when I was listening to the sermon, that and you didn't spend a lot of time there, but I thought about it, which was, as you said, he wanted to go there years earlier, and for reasons that God only knew. God did want him to go there, as it turns out, but things needed to take place perhaps in Ephesus, perhaps in Paul. And it's an interesting thing just to think about our own lives as we think about not just the mission, the advancement of the mission, but just the growth of our own lives and development of our own lives, that God sometimes closes a door, which doesn't seem right to us, doesn't seem smart to us, doesn't seem like, I believe God would want me to go there. This isn't some selfish thing necessarily. Paul wasn't being selfish in wanting to go to Ephesus earlier in his career, but he was going there to do God's work, but God said no. So It's just an interesting point to bring up. And then the other thing, I'll kind of dive right into the middle of your sermon, is I'm not sure why God said no, earlier in the narrative, but when you get to Ephesus, I don't know how to best describe it. You did an interesting job of just the spiritual power, the spiritual darkness, the burning of these scrolls, and which represents, I guess, both the ideas of the world, the false gods that we may have, even spiritual darkness. And you didn't get into this either necessarily, but the whole chapter of Ephesians 6. Oh yeah. All of these things that we see in this great letter, which ends with this whole, those of us who remember Ephesians 6, the spiritual warfare passage that is the longest extended in the New Testament, comes from this chapter. So dive in a little bit as you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, so Ephesus is this place where it's a center of religious, ceremony of the day. Paul ends up getting in trouble for this big revival that happens. Yes. We don't read about it in this week, but if we were to go on and speak about it, Paul ends up getting in big time trouble because the people saw it as a revolt against Artemis,
Right.
or Diana of the Ephesians,
Right.
which was the center of temple worship of the day.
Right.
So very spiritually dark place.
Right.
But in the midst of this spiritual darkness is where God is working in, you might say, some of the strongest that you see in all of Acts.
That's
in
right.
this very dark place, and yet God is working
That's right.
powerfully in the midst of it all.
Well, one thing you said I thought was really interesting about that very point was that this place was very dark. It had this almost perhaps in some ways, like you were saying, as much as Athens in its own way, maybe not as many idols, but as much spiritual power ascribed to idols, including this great fell from heaven, the whole world knows. We don't know if that's hyperbole, but that's how they describe it in these two chapters that as you mentioned, Acts 19 and 20. But God wanted to demonstrate in an environment where there was so much, I don't know, allure and interest in spiritual power,
Right.
real or imagined, we don't know. If the devil wasn't, we're not sure of all what was going on there. But even as you mentioned, the scrolls being worth, I think you mentioned in modern terms, $11 million. Is that what you said?
11 million. Yep.
So this was, these things had real power ascribed to them, but God wanted to show His power was greater.
Exactly. And you see that with the 7 sons of Sceva first, where they're just trying to use Jesus' name just on their own. And just, there must be something to this Jesus thing. Let's just try using the name. And there was thought around that time of if you use a name, there's power associated with certain names. And so they just thought, you could use Jesus' name like you use any other kind of spell.
Right, incantation,
just like, we'll just throw Jesus on the top of that.
Right.
And they end up paying a pretty steep price for that in terms of getting beaten up and kicked out of the house naked. I mean, part of it is kind of comical if you were to just read it. It's kind of comical. But there's a definite point in the passage and that you can't live off of other people's spirituality.
Yes, I thought that was so. That was a very powerful point as I was listening. You can't live off of other people's spirituality. And what happens when you and I do that? One example you mentioned was kids who grow up. It's understandable. You just want your kids to grow out of it, but they grow up sort of riding your spiritual coattails if you're their moms and dads or their mentors. And in a sense, we almost want that because we're trying to, socialize our children, direct them, and it's okay for a season. But if an 18-year-old or a 22-year-old or a 32-year-old is still, in a sense, riding their parent, they believe in Jesus because that's the way they grew up, they're going to be challenged. Life will challenge you and help you see that is not healthy, isn't going to give you the power that you need. And maybe in many cases today, we have this big word of, deconstruction. People leave their faith, I think, for that very reason. So that was a very powerful point.
Yeah. And I mean, it's one of those things we got to be proactive about. And I think as a parent, it's one of those things I'm always thinking about. Certainly my experience plays into that too, but
Son of a pastor.
Yeah, so that's right. I mean, if you grow up in an environment where the answers are given to you, you're like, okay, well, I guess that's okay. But after a while, that doesn't cut it.
Right.
So even as I think through with my kids, just, from fairly early on, just saying, you're going to have to make this decision on your own. I'm with you in the journey, but this is going to be a decision eventually you're going to have to make on your own.
That's right.
I think is important. All of us need to come to that too in our life. So certainly that's demonstrated for us in the passage with these 7 sons of Sceva. But then people in the passage see this happen and then they react to it going, oh my goodness, this Jesus is real.
Yeah.
You just can't use his name like you use other names.
Right.
And that causes a crisis of belief in them.
That's right.
What am I going to do with this?
Yeah.
If Jesus really is this powerful, what does that mean for me?
That's right.
And I think they look at their scrolls at that point and they go, these things are empty.
Yeah.
Compared to Jesus,
these
things don't hold the power that they say they hold.
Yeah.
And they burn them. For you and me to burn $11 million worth of something.
Right.
You could see Judas kind of going in, you could have sold those things and given it to the poor or something like that. And they're like, no, these things are absolute garbage.
You know what reminds me of, you didn't bring this up and I didn't think of it, but some of us might know the simple parable of the the pearl of great price, where she's just making a simple point where some, in this hypothetical story, someone finds this incredibly valuable jewel, and it's almost like, wow. And they bury it and go and sell everything they have, right? Sell their house, sell their everything so they can buy it. And it's Jesus, I think, is making the simple point of comparative value.
Yes.
When you intersect something that you finally realize and you see the value of it, it puts everything else it casts a shadow on everything else in your life. And I think what you're saying is, what a powerful, maybe you're even leading us there, or you did, I should say, in the sermon, as we were called to say, what is our comparative value? What is, I loved it was such an interesting, clever idea of, what's on your scroll, to say, we have to acknowledge it. And sometimes it's, we could dismiss Acts 19 to say this is the old world. We don't deal in magic arts or whatever you want to say. But I think you did a good job of saying, well, not so fast.
Right.
We have our version of let's call them whatever we hold on to. It might not be a physical object. We might not have written it down. It might not be in a closet somewhere. But we have things on our hearts, minds that we are holding on to, as if it was a source of security, a source of secret power. And that's really when we finally see, you might say, instead of the lie in my right hand or the false God in my right hand, we can lay it down because we see it in light of who Christ is.
Yeah. That's the essence of it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the point. I think that they're really the passage is trying to pull out for us, is to identify what is that. What are those ways? And I, even before I approached this passage, I hadn't really studied the Greek in there before, but the word sorcery, I said it, is only used twice.
Where was the other time? Do you remember?
It's 1 Timothy 5, where he's saying, beware of, he's kind of saying these people, these busybodies who go around and...
so it's not, it doesn't, the word, it doesn't say sorcery.
It doesn't say sorcery.
English is in Timothy.
Yeah,
I see, okay,
in
gotcha.
Timothy, it refers to it as busybody.
Okay.
In other words, it's really obsession with theories that aren't the gospel.
Interesting.
So
love that.
It's pretty phenomenal when you look at that word and you go, what is today? Like we're obsessed with theories that aren't the main thing, that distract us from the truth.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a real opportunity for us, because we live in this water, we swim in these same waters, to go, what are those in my life? And we can do it without knowing it.
Right. That's right.
Subtly.
Right.
Like what are, politically, we've talked about that before. Is that...
Has politics become a false god, a pseudo-religion, a way that we would never say this, but, it's Jesus plus the politics that help us get there. Or it's God needs some help.
Right.
I mean, no one would say that out loud, but in a sense, you might say that's how we look at it. Or other, theories, ideas that we either we can articulate them fully or not, that become false security for us. And that's kind of a scroll. And it's interesting now when I'm thinking about it, because when I think of scroll, I think more of sacred writing,
right,
as opposed to as opposed to dark arts, So sacred writing, right? Scrolls are sacred. Even in the day of Paul, or the day of the Acts 19 passage, I imagine the scriptures, to the degree they were written down, were written on scrolls. Right. Those would be good scrolls, so to speak. So in that sense, it makes the analogy isn't hard to work. It's what are the other sacred writings, you might say, that we have in our lives, our hearts, our minds, that we are living by. Yeah. That whether we fully grasp it or acknowledge it, or it's that obvious to us or others, that we really need to identify, surrender, so that we can experience the power of God in a way that's God meant to us to experience.
Right. Yeah. And you think about this passage, where it was written, who it was written to. who eventually becomes part of their. John the Apostle eventually lives in Ephesus, and he writes First John. I've been reading First John lately. He writes First John probably in the context of Ephesus, and he's addressing Gnosticism, this idea that there's a secret knowledge out there to be known.
That's right.
That's
only certain people have.
Right. That only certain people have.
Right.
I mean,
right.
We're kind of living in a Gnostic age.
Yeah, if that's Gnosticism,
yes,
then it's not a thing of the past.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, we think of these things as, we would never believe in those things.
That's right.
Well, guess what? I feel like this is a time at which we need to bring these things up for ourselves, for our own health, to go.
I had someone say to me, just the last comment I thought was interesting, about young people, so totally different discussion, and said, young people today, let's call them Gen Z or whatever we call them these days, that what's unique about their generation, they said they've had so much time in the generation that precedes them of false narratives. We might call it fake news. The guy didn't use that term. That what they want is, they're hungry for, is the straight, unadulterated truth, right? Because they've lived in an environment where there's so much false truth. So that tells you, back to the point you were just making, that this is not an old problem if we can really see it. And I think your final application to say, what's the sacred writings, beliefs that you have, lies that we tell ourselves, half-truths that we tell ourselves, that we really want to lay down. And so the final application was really, I hope you were in church, if you did listen to it, to really think hard about it, talk about it at your group. Maybe you'll decide that you all have the same scroll. Maybe you don't. And maybe that's one way to share with the people that you most do life with, and get to know each other a little bit better, so that we can pray for each other. Because what I've noticed, as I thought hard about your sermon, is, this isn't a one and done.
Right.
So I have, whatever's on my scroll, whatever, ideas that I tend to lean on for security as a way to make my, to control the world, they don't go away just because I confessed them once, because I identified them. So we need each other to be able to know that, so we can pray intelligently for each other. So guys, I hope you gets a lot of value out of this last message as we think about, I think the last verse said something like, they burned their scrolls, and the word,
spread wildly.
That's our hope as a church, as we continue to do the work on ourselves, and as a church, the message, the new mission can expand in our day and age. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you next time at Between Two Sermons.
Boom.